I canceled my mother-in-law's credit card without saying a word. Not because of debt, not because of limits, but because I discovered she was using it to shop with my husband's mistress. Luxury bags, weekend getaways, gifts meant to hurt me quietly. I waited, knowing exactly what would happen next. Then the notification hit. Transaction failed. I never imagined betrayal would announce itself through a banking app notification, but that's exactly how my marriage began to unravel. I was standing in the grocery store aisle, debating between brands of pasta when my phone vibrated. The alert wasn't dramatic. No flashing warnings. Just a quiet message informing me of a declined transaction on an account I technically wasn't supposed to monitor anymore. An account linked to my mother-in-law. An account I had paid off, maintained, and trusted for years without question. That moment felt small, ordinary, and forgettable, yet quietly carried the weight of everything ahead. I stared at the screen longer than necessary, pretending it was a mistake while my stomach tightened. My mother-in-law rarely shopped midday, and never online. She preferred cash, liked control, hated paper trails. That account had rules. Groceries, prescriptions, utilities. Nothing indulgent, nothing personal, certainly nothing shared. I told myself there had to be an explanation, because admitting the alternative meant acknowledging cracks I had spent years smoothing over with patience, excuses, and silence. Those habits had become my armor, polished daily, until I barely noticed how heavy they were or how much they were costing me emotionally and spiritually. I checked the merchant name, and my breath caught. A boutique hotel 2 towns over, the kind with spa robes and curated playlists. Not somewhere my mother-in-law would ever step foot alone. My mind raced through dates, excuses, and memories, aligning details I had ignored. My husband's late meetings, his sudden interest in scented candles, the way his phone tilted away from me at night. Patterns form quietly before they scream. I stood frozen, pasta forgotten, realizing the story I feared had already begun without my consent, and I was the last person to read the script until now, finally. I paid for my groceries and sat in my car, hands resting on the steering wheel, breathing through the shock. Anger came later. First was clarity, sharp and unwelcome. This wasn't suspicion anymore. It was evidence. Someone thought I was too distracted, too kind, or too naive to notice. They were wrong. I opened the banking app again, scrolled through recent activity, and felt something steady settle inside me. In that stillness, I understood the power of quiet decisions made without warning or permission, especially when everyone else assumes you will continue to tolerate the unbearable like before always again. My relationship with my mother-in-law had always been polite, distant, and transactional. She smiled when required, praised me in public, and criticized me in whispers. I funded her comfort because it kept the peace. My husband framed it as respect, family obligation. I called it compromise. Looking back, I see how easily generosity becomes entitlement when boundaries remain unspoken and consequences never arrive. She enjoyed the benefits without accountability, confident the system supporting her would never question loyalty. That confidence was misplaced, built on assumptions I was finally prepared to dismantle carefully without asking permission from anyone else involved. My husband, meanwhile, had perfected the art of plausible innocence. He listened selectively, forgot conveniently, and apologized vaguely when confronted with discomfort. He called me emotional when I asked questions, dramatic when I pressed for clarity. The affair, I realized, wasn't just physical. It was structural. It relied on everyone else playing their assigned roles while pretending nothing was wrong. I had been cast as the stabilizer, the one who absorbed chaos so others could indulge freely. Once I recognized that script, I knew my refusal would collapse their entire performance and expose everything they hoped to keep hidden forever. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't cry, scream, or demand explanations. Instead, I sat there, engine idling, and made a decision rooted in precision rather than emotion. I would remove access, not dramatically, not publicly, quietly, the same way they had betrayed me. I selected the account, navigated the settings, and changed one number. A limit became 0. No speeches, no warnings, just an invisible wall appearing where comfort once flowed freely. I closed the app, knowing the next notification would tell me everything I needed about who believed they were entitled to my silence alone forever after all this. The call came faster than I expected. Not from my husband. Not at first. It was her. Breathless, indignant, offended by inconvenience. She didn't ask what happened. She demanded correction. Her voice carried the shock of someone encountering resistance for the first time. I listened without interrupting, letting every accusation reveal exactly how little respect she believed I deserved. In her outrage, she confirmed my suspicions, proving this arrangement had never been mutual or grateful. I ended the call calmly, resisting the urge to explain myself to someone unworthy of explanations or continued access to my resources ever again now. When my husband finally called, his tone was confusion masquerading as concern. He asked if I'd touched the account, as if the audacity itself offended him. I said yes. Silence followed. In that pause, years of imbalance surfaced. He hadn't protected me. He hadn't warned me. He had assumed I would absorb the damage quietly, as always. That assumption was the true betrayal, more damaging than any affair conducted in shadows. I told him nothing else, allowing uncertainty to do the work confrontation never could for people accustomed to comfort without consequence or accountability ever again from me today onward. That night, I slept better than I had in months. Not because things were resolved, but because something fundamental had shifted. I had chosen myself. The silence they feared wasn't my weakness anymore. It was my boundary. And somewhere in a boutique hotel lobby or checkout line, a card was being declined, rewriting the balance of power quietly. This was only the beginning, though they didn't know it yet, and I was no longer interested in sparing feelings. Some lessons require discomfort, and some reckonings begin with a single failed transaction that echoes louder than any argument ever could. The days that followed were marked by tension, unanswered messages, and carefully staged confusion. I moved through my routine with a new awareness, watching reactions instead of managing emotions. My husband oscillated between charm and irritation. My mother-in-law sent clipped texts filled with indignation. Each response confirmed what I already knew. The system only functioned when I cooperated. Removing that cooperation felt dangerous to them, but liberating to me in ways I was just beginning to understand. For the first time, their comfort was no longer my responsibility, and that realization changed how I saw every relationship around me completely. I didn't know yet how far this would go or what it would ultimately cost. I only knew I was done pretending ignorance was kindness. Boundaries, once set, have consequences, and I was prepared to face mine. Whatever came next, it would unfold on different terms. Ones I had finally chosen deliberately after years of being chosen last. The story everyone assumed they understood was about to be rewritten, starting with the parts they never expected me to control. And this time, I would not soften the truth to protect anyone, especially those who had never protected me at all. The morning after the card was declined, the house felt different, like it had shifted an inch off its foundation overnight. Nothing looked wrong at first glance. The coffee machine hummed. Sunlight spilled across the kitchen counter. But underneath the routine, something was vibrating, tense, and unresolved. My husband moved through the space like a guest unsure of the rules. He kissed my cheek too deliberately, asked if I slept well, lingered for an answer he didn't deserve. I replied politely, neutrally, offering nothing he could use to regain footing. Silence, I was learning, had weight when wielded intentionally. He left for work early, claiming a meeting he hadn't mentioned before. I didn't question it. I didn't check his location or scroll through his messages. That urge had evaporated. Once you see the structure of deception clearly, you stop obsessing over details. The betrayal wasn't hidden anymore. It was exposed in how quickly panic replaced confidence the moment access was removed. I poured my coffee, sat at the table, and allowed myself to feel the calm that comes when you stop performing emotional labor for people who misuse it. My phone buzzed mid-morning. A text from my mother-in-law, long and theatrical. She accused the bank of incompetence, suggested fraud, hinted at legal action, and finally circled back to me. Had I touched the account? Her phrasing was careful, but the accusation bled through. I read it once and set the phone down. No response. I wasn't going to soothe her anxiety or explain my boundaries to someone who believed they were optional. Letting her sit with uncertainty felt appropriate. Consequences rarely arrive with explanations, and that lesson was overdue. By noon, mutual acquaintances began reaching out, thinly veiled under the guise of casual check-ins. Had something happened? Was everything okay with the family? I recognized the pattern immediately. Information was being gathered. Narratives were forming without my input. In the past, I would have rushed to correct misunderstandings, to present myself as reasonable and accommodating. This time, I let the silence speak. If people wanted answers, they could ask directly. I was finished managing reputations that weren't mine to maintain. That afternoon, my husband came home unannounced. He stood in the doorway of my office, watching me type, waiting for acknowledgement. I didn't look up. Eventually, he cleared his throat, asked if we could talk. I said not right now. The rejection startled him. He was used to access, used to immediate engagement. He tried again, softer, apologetic without substance. I still didn't turn. When he left the room, I felt something release in my chest. Power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it withdraws quietly and leaves others scrambling to fill the void. Later, I received the message I had anticipated since the moment I changed the limit. Not from her this time, but from the woman whose presence I had only inferred until now. A name I didn't recognize. A tone dripping with confusion and entitlement. She asked if there had been a mistake, said she was embarrassed to check out, implied inconvenience. She didn't apologize. She didn't introduce herself properly. She assumed I would fix it. That assumption told me everything about the dynamic they had built behind my back, one where my role was invisible but essential. I didn't reply. Instead, I forwarded the message to my husband with a single line. "Who is this?" Minutes passed before he responded. Too many minutes. When his reply came, it was evasive, poorly constructed, insulting in its attempt at explanation. He claimed she was a colleague, a friend of his mother's, someone who had borrowed the card temporarily. The lies stacked clumsily, each one less convincing than the last. I didn't argue. I simply said we would talk later. That ambiguity unsettled him more than confrontation ever could. That night, he tried a different tactic. He cooked dinner, opened a bottle of wine, spoke nostalgically about our early years, about how strong we were, how people envied us. I listened, unmoved. Nostalgia is often deployed as a distraction when accountability looms. When he finally asked what I wanted, I told him the truth. I wanted honesty, respect, and transparency. Not tomorrow. Not eventually. Now. He nodded, agreed too quickly, promised too easily. I recognized the performance. It was the same one he'd used whenever discomfort threatened his comfort. After dinner, I went for a walk alone. The neighborhood felt quieter than usual, as if the world had slowed to observe the shift unfolding inside me. I realized how much energy I had spent anticipating other people's reactions, cushioning their emotions, smoothing their paths. Removing that burden-created space I didn't know I needed. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger had sharpened into resolve. Whatever came next, I would not negotiate my dignity. I had already paid too much for the illusion of peace. When I returned, my husband was on the phone, voice low, urgent. He hung up quickly when he saw me. I didn't ask who it was. I didn't need to. The web they had spun was tightening, and they could feel it. I went to bed without another word. As I lay there, I thought about how systems collapse not when confronted directly, but when their quiet enablers step away. I had stepped away. The fallout was inevitable, and I was ready to face it without flinching. The next morning, the bank called. They asked if the recent change was intentional. I confirmed it was. They noted increased activity and flagged concern. I thanked them for their diligence. Hanging up, I smiled. Even institutions recognize boundaries more readily than the people closest to me. That realization stung, but it also strengthened my resolve. This wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming agency in a story that had been rewritten without my consent. By the end of the week, the silence had done its work. The frantic energy had shifted into something darker, more desperate. And still I waited, because timing matters. And when the next confrontation came, it would happen on ground I had already prepared. The decline was only the first tremor. The real quake was coming, and they were standing directly over the fault line, unaware that I had already stepped aside. By the weekend, the narrative had officially escaped the house. I could feel it in the way people spoke to me, cautiously curious, overly polite, as if I were made of glass and might shatter if pressed too hard. Invitations arrived that felt less like kindness and more like reconnaissance. Coffee dates framed as concern. Phone calls that lingered too long on pauses. Everyone wanted to know what was happening, but no one wanted to be the first to ask directly. That hesitation told me something important. They sensed imbalance. They just didn't know where it originated. My husband attempted transparency that Sunday morning. He sat across from me at the kitchen table, hands folded, voice rehearsed. He admitted there was someone else. He framed it as a mistake, a lapse, a confusing period. He said it hadn't meant anything serious. He avoided the word affair like it might detonate if spoken aloud. I let him talk uninterrupted, watching how carefully he positioned himself as conflicted rather than calculating. When he finished, he waited for absolution. Instead, I asked one question. How long has my mother been funding your relationship? His eyes flickered before he masked it. That moment was the answer. He claimed ignorance, said his mother offered help, said he hadn't thought it through. The excuses piled up, each one revealing a deeper disrespect. It wasn't just that he cheated. It was that he allowed another woman to benefit from resources tied to me, while his mother facilitated it without hesitation. That wasn't accidental. That was alignment. I realized then that I wasn't dealing with individual betrayals, but a collective decision that my feelings, contributions, and boundaries were expendable, that I told him I needed space. He protested, asked what that meant, demanded clarity. I gave him none. I packed a small bag and left for a hotel across town. Not a dramatic exit, just enough distance to breathe. That night, alone in a quiet room, I replayed years of subtle dismissals and reframed them with brutal honesty. I had been generous. They had been opportunistic, naming that truth hurt, but it also untangled the confusion that had kept me stuck. The next morning, my phone exploded. His mother left voicemails alternating between rage and victimhood. She accused me of cruelty, of destroying the family, of overreacting. She invoked tradition, loyalty, sacrifice. She never apologized. Not once. The mistress sent another message, this one sharper, accusing me of humiliation. I deleted it without reading fully. My husband sent long paragraphs filled with regret and promises. I muted the thread. Noise has a way of diluting clarity, and I was determined to protect mine. I spent that day walking the city, observing strangers, reminding myself that my world was larger than this betrayal. I sat in a cafe and wrote everything down. Not for them, for me. Facts instead of feelings. Dates, transactions, conversations, patterns. Seeing it laid out stripped the situation of its emotional fog. This wasn't chaos. It was behavior. And behavior has consequences, whether people like them or not. That afternoon, I made appointments. A lawyer, a financial advisor, a therapist. Not because I was panicking, but because preparation is a form of self-respect. I refused to be reactive. I would be strategic. The power dynamic had already shifted when I stopped explaining myself. Now, I was solidifying that shift with structure. Every meeting felt grounding, each step reinforcing that I was no longer improvising within someone else's script. When I returned home days later, the house felt smaller. My husband hovered, uncertain of his place. His mother was conspicuously absent. I learned later she had been loudly complaining to anyone who would listen, painting herself as the victim of an ungrateful daughter-in-law. I didn't counter it. Let her talk. People reveal themselves when they think they're justified. Meanwhile, I quietly redirected finances, documented assets, and closed doors I had once left open out of kindness. The confrontation I knew was coming arrived sooner than expected. She showed up unannounced, keys in hand, entitlement intact. She demanded to be heard. I allowed it. She accused me of jealousy, of selfishness, of destroying her son's happiness. I listened until she finished, then told her calmly that her access to my resources was permanently revoked. Not suspended, revoked. The word landed heavily. She scoffed, threatened legal action, family backlash, estrangement. I nodded. Threats only work when the person receiving them fears the outcome. I didn't anymore. She left in a fury. My husband stood frozen, caught between loyalties he had never expected to reconcile. I told him the truth he had avoided for years, that his failure to set boundaries had cost him trust, that repairing this would require more than apologies. It would require accountability and distance from the people who enabled his worst choices. I didn't ask him to choose. I simply told him what I would no longer tolerate. The difference mattered. That night, alone again, I felt grief rise unexpectedly. Not for the affair, but for the version of myself that believed love meant endurance without limits. Letting go of that belief felt like mourning a former life. But grief, I was learning, is not a sign of weakness. It is proof that something mattered enough to be transformed. And I was transforming, whether they were ready for it or not. The story circulating about me was already changing. Some painted me as cold, others as empowered. I didn't correct either. Labels are distractions. What mattered was that the truth was no longer hidden from me. The decline had set everything in motion, and now the reckoning was unfolding exactly as it needed to. I wasn't done, not even close, but I was steady. And for the first time in a long while, that steadiness felt like home. The shift in dynamics became unmistakable once money stopped cushioning their mistakes. Entitlement doesn't disappear quietly. It protests loudly when challenged. Within days, my mother-in-law began calling extended family, framing the situation as a misunderstanding fueled by my insecurity. She leaned on familiarity and nostalgia, reminding them of holidays she hosted, favors she'd done, sacrifices she claimed to have made. What she didn't mention was the credit card, the hotel, or the woman standing beside her son while spending money that was never hers to use that way. Selective truth is a powerful weapon for people who rely on image rather than integrity. I heard about these conversations secondhand. Cousins reached out with concern disguised as curiosity. An aunt asked if everything was all right, her voice already tilted toward judgment. I answered neutrally, refusing to defend myself against narratives built on omissions. Defensiveness implies guilt. Silence, when supported by facts, communicates confidence. Slowly, the tone of those inquiries shifted. People began asking different questions. Practical ones. What really happened? How long had this been going on? Why had the account been in my name to begin with? Curiosity replaced accusation, and I let it. My husband struggled visibly. Without his mother's financial buffer, and without my emotional labor smoothing things over, he seemed unmoored. He vacillated between remorse and resentment, apologizing one moment and blaming me the next for making things worse. I reminded him calmly that exposure doesn't create damage, it reveals it. If the truth destabilized his life, perhaps it was never as solid as he believed. That realization unsettled him more than anger ever could. He began to understand that reconciliation wasn't guaranteed and that his comfort was no longer the priority. The mistress faded quickly once the benefits disappeared. She stopped messaging when she realized access wasn't returning. That silence was telling. Whatever connection she claimed to have with my husband couldn't survive without financial convenience. He noticed too, though he didn't comment on it directly. Some lessons land quietly, settling in long after the noise dies down. Watching him process that loss without my intervention felt strange but necessary. I wasn't there to manage his disappointment anymore. Meanwhile, I focused on rebuilding routines that belonged to me alone. Morning walks, reading without distraction, reconnecting with friends I had unintentionally neglected while maintaining family peace. Those friendships welcomed me back without questions or conditions. They reminded me who I was before I learned to shrink for harmony. In their company, I laughed freely again. I spoke without filtering my thoughts. That contrast highlighted how much of myself I had muted over the years to avoid conflict that was never truly avoided, only postponed. One evening, my husband asked if we could attend counseling together. Counseling would strip away the narratives he'd used to justify himself. But growth rarely occurs in comfort, and I wasn't willing to continue stagnating to protect his ego. The first session was tense. He spoke about feeling torn between loyalty to his mother and commitment to our marriage. The therapist asked why those loyalties were in conflict to begin with. Silence followed. That question landed heavily. I explained my position clearly, without embellishment. Boundaries had been crossed. Trust had been compromised. Repair would require distance from enabling behavior, not just apologies. Naming that truth out loud felt empowering. I wasn't attacking him. I was asserting myself. Outside the therapy room, his mother escalated. She showed up at our home again, demanding access, threatening to expose me. I reminded her calmly that any further contact would go through legal channels. She laughed, certain I wouldn't follow through. People accustomed to impunity often mistake restraint for weakness. She left, still confident. That confidence wouldn't last. Within a week, she received formal notice outlining the revocation of financial privileges and clear boundaries regarding communication. The reaction was immediate and explosive. She called crying, furious, pleading, oscillating between victim and aggressor. I didn't respond. I had said what needed to be said in writing. Letting professionals handle the rest was another act of self-preservation. The family response shifted noticeably after that. Some distanced themselves. Others reached out quietly to apologize for assumptions. I accepted those apologies without revisiting details. Accountability doesn't require endless rehashing. It requires acknowledgement and change behavior. I was done educating people on my worth. Those willing to see it would. Those who weren't were free to step back. As weeks passed, the financial stability I reclaimed translated into emotional clarity. Without the constant drain of supporting others' choices, I felt lighter. Decisions became easier. Sleep came more naturally. I began to envision a future not defined by endurance, but by alignment. Whether that future included my husband remained uncertain, but for the first time, that uncertainty didn't terrify me. I trusted myself enough to handle whatever outcome emerged. One night, after another counseling session, my husband admitted something he had avoided saying out loud. He had relied on his mother to shield him from consequences his entire life. She fixed problems with money, influence, or guilt. Losing that safety net frightened him more than losing the affair. That admission cracked something open. It wasn't absolution, but it was honesty. And honesty, while insufficient on its own, is a starting point. I told him plainly that growth would require discomfort. That disentangling from his mother's control wasn't punishment, it was adulthood. Whether he chose that path was up to him. I wouldn't push or wait indefinitely. My life was moving forward, with or without him. Saying that out loud felt definitive, like closing a door I had left ajar for years. The entitlement that once dominated our household was dissolving, replaced by accountability and consequence. Watching that transformation wasn't satisfying in the way revenge stories promise. It was sobering, necessary. Change rarely arrives with applause. Often, it comes with loss. But as I stood in the quiet of a life recalibrating itself, I knew I would never regret choosing myself. The cost of entitlement had been paid, and I was finally free to decide what came next. The real reckoning didn't arrive with shouting or slammed doors. It arrived quietly, in moments that forced everyone involved to confront realities they had long avoided. Once the financial lifeline was severed and the usual emotional buffers were gone, patterns emerged with uncomfortable clarity. People stopped pretending things were misunderstandings. They started acknowledging choices. And for the first time, I wasn't the one holding everything together while everyone else fell apart. My husband's behavior shifted in subtle but telling ways. He stopped defending his mother reflexively. He hesitated before speaking, weighing his words instead of throwing them out carelessly. That hesitation was new. It meant he was finally considering consequences rather than assuming forgiveness. One evening, he admitted he'd never questioned the arrangement before because it benefited him. His mother handled logistics, smoothed conflicts, and provided resources. He got comfort without responsibility. Saying it out loud made him visibly uncomfortable, as if naming the truth stripped it of its protective power. His mother, on the other hand, doubled down. Without access to money or influence over our household, she attempted to regain control through public sympathy. She showed up at family gatherings uninvited, tearful and dramatic, telling half-truths designed to paint herself as abandoned. The difference now was that I wasn't present to counterbalance her narrative. And without my quiet cooperation, her stories sounded hollow. People noticed inconsistencies. They compared notes. The cracks in her image widened without my effort. I was surprised by how little satisfaction that brought me. I didn't feel triumphant watching her lose credibility. I felt resolved, detached, like I was observing the natural outcome of actions rather than orchestrating punishment. That detachment was important. It meant my choices were no longer reactive. I wasn't driven by anger or the need to be understood. I was driven by alignment with my values, and that shift changed everything. At work, my focus sharpened. Freed from constant emotional drain, I excelled in ways I hadn't realized I'd been holding back. Colleagues noticed. Opportunities opened. It wasn't that my life suddenly became perfect. It was that I finally had the capacity to show up fully without carrying everyone else's burdens. That competence reinforced my confidence. I wasn't surviving anymore. I was building something solid, intentional, and mine. One afternoon, I received an unexpected call from a family member who had always stayed neutral. She apologized for not speaking up sooner. She admitted she'd sensed something was wrong for years but didn't want to get involved. Her honesty surprised me. It also confirmed something I'd suspected. Silence from others often isn't agreement. It's avoidance. People choose comfort over courage far more often than they admit. Accepting that truth helped me let go of resentment toward those who hadn't defended me. The biggest shift came during counseling. My husband was finally forced to confront how deeply enmeshed his identity was with his mother's approval. He realized he'd never learned to set boundaries because none were modeled for him. That realization didn't excuse his behavior, but it contextualized it. Understanding the roots of dysfunction doesn't erase harm, but it does clarify the work required to heal. Whether he was capable of that work remained uncertain. One session ended with a question directed at both of us. What would a healthy future look like, independently of each other? The question lingered long after we left the room. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine a life that didn't revolve around managing someone else's emotions. That vision felt expansive, peaceful, scary in its freedom. I realized then that reconciliation, if it happened, would be a choice rather than an obligation. And that distinction mattered more than anything. His mother made one final attempt to reassert control. She sent a message filled with regret, apologies, and promises to change. But beneath the words was an expectation of reinstatement. She wanted access restored. When it didn't happen, the apologies stopped. The switch was immediate. That confirmed everything I needed to know. Accountability that depends on reward isn't accountability at all. It's negotiation. And I was no longer negotiating my boundaries. Weeks passed. The chaos settled into a new normal. My husband moved into a separate space temporarily to focus on individual therapy. The distance was necessary. It allowed both of us to assess our lives without the pressure of immediate resolution. I didn't chase him. I didn't monitor his progress. I trusted that whatever growth occurred had to be self-motivated to be real. That trust extended to myself as well. I trusted my ability to walk away if needed. During that time, I rediscovered parts of myself I'd set aside. Creativity, curiosity, ambition untethered from obligation. I traveled alone. I reconnected with hobbies that brought joy rather than validation. Each experience reinforced the same lesson. I was capable of sustaining a fulfilling life independently. That knowledge was grounding. It meant that staying would be a deliberate act of partnership, not fear of loss. The reckoning everyone expected to be explosive turned out to be introspective. It dismantled assumptions quietly, steadily, without theatrics. It exposed how much had been built on convenience rather than respect. And it offered a choice: continue old patterns and accept their consequences, or do the hard work of change. I knew which path I was on. Whether others would follow was no longer my concern. By the time my husband asked to talk seriously about the future, I was ready. Not desperate, not defensive. Ready. Whatever decision we reached would come from clarity, not chaos. And that, more than anything, was the victory no one saw coming. I hadn't just canceled a credit card. I had canceled my role as the silent enabler in someone else's story. And that change was permanent. The moment power fully shifted wasn't marked by a single conversation or dramatic decision. It revealed itself in how differently people responded to me once they realized I wasn't backing down. The frantic urgency faded. The manipulation softened into caution. I could see it in their eyes, hear it in their pauses. They were recalibrating, reassessing how much influence they still had, and discovering it was far less than they'd assumed. That realization unsettled them in ways no argument ever could. My husband returned home one evening to talk. Not to plead, not to defend, but to listen. That alone told me something had changed. He sat across from me without his usual armor, hands open, posture unsure. He asked what I wanted genuinely this time, without trying to steer my answer. I told him the truth. I wanted consistency. I wanted boundaries enforced even when they were inconvenient. I wanted a partner who chose integrity over comfort. I didn't demand promises. I asked for actions. He nodded slowly, understanding the difference. He told me he had confronted his mother. Not gently, not diplomatically. He told her involvement had crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed, that her financial manipulation and emotional pressure had damaged his marriage. She denied it at first, then cried, then accused him of betrayal. He didn't relent. Hearing this, I felt something unexpected. Not relief, but validation. For the first time, he was standing in the discomfort instead of outsourcing it to me. Whether it would last was uncertain, but the effort mattered. His mother's reaction was predictable. She cut him off temporarily, declaring she needed space. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same woman who had demanded constant access now withdrew when her authority was challenged. Control often masquerades as care until it's questioned. I didn't celebrate her absence. I simply noted it. Absence can be revealing. It shows what remains when obligation is removed. In the weeks that followed, I noticed how my own reactions had changed. I no longer braced myself before difficult conversations. I didn't rehearse explanations or soften truths. I spoke plainly, trusting that clarity was kinder than avoidance. That shift affected every area of my life. Friends responded with respect. Colleagues engaged more directly. Even strangers treated me differently. Confidence, I realized, isn't loud. It's consistent. The affair, once the central wound, faded into context. It became one symptom of a larger pattern rather than the defining event. That reframing helped me process the pain without letting it consume my identity. I wasn't the betrayed wife clinging to answers. I was a person reclaiming agency after years of quiet compromise. That distinction mattered. It changed how I spoke about the experience, both to myself and others. One afternoon, I received a message from the mistress. Not defensive this time, apologetic. She claimed she hadn't known the extent of the situation, that she'd been told the marriage was effectively over. I didn't respond, not because I was angry, but because closure doesn't always require dialogue. Sometimes it requires disengagement. Her understanding, or lack thereof, had no bearing on my healing. Letting that be enough felt like progress. My husband continued therapy, both individual and joint. Progress was uneven. Some days he showed insight and accountability. Other days, old habits resurfaced. I didn't rush him. I observed. Patterns reveal themselves over time, not through declarations. I was patient without being passive. That balance took practice, but felt right. I wasn't waiting for him to change. I was watching to see if he could. The extended family settled into a new equilibrium. Some relationships cooled permanently. Others strengthened. I learned who valued truth over comfort, who respected boundaries even when they disagreed. That knowledge was invaluable. It allowed me to invest my energy where it was reciprocated. I stopped chasing validation from people invested in preserving their version of events. Letting go of that need freed me in ways I hadn't anticipated. There was a moment, months later, when I realized I hadn't thought about the credit card in weeks. What began as a single decision had expanded into a complete realignment of my life. The card was never the point. It was the symbol. It represented access, entitlement, and the expectation that I would always absorb inconvenience to keep others comfortable. Canceling it was the first boundary. Everything else followed. My husband asked eventually if I thought we could rebuild. Not return to what we were, but create something new. I told him I didn't know. That honesty was important. Hope without guarantees is risky, but so is staying out of fear. We agreed to continue the work without forcing outcomes. Whether our paths converged or diverged, they would do so intentionally. That agreement felt like respect. The power shift was complete when I realized I was no longer afraid of either outcome. Staying or leaving no longer felt like a verdict on my worth. It felt like a choice. That freedom was the greatest gift to come from the chaos. I had learned to trust myself, to set boundaries without apology, to walk away from dynamics that required my diminishment. Whatever came next would be built on that foundation. Looking back, I understood why their reaction to the decline had been so explosive. It wasn't about the inconvenience. It was about losing control over a narrative they believed was fixed. Changing that narrative required only one thing: my refusal to play along. Everything else followed naturally. And once that door closed, I knew with certainty I would never open it again for anyone who mistook my kindness for obligation. After the apologies faded, what remained was reality without the cushioning of guilt or promises. This was the part no one talks about. The quiet aftermath where accountability either becomes a habit or dissolves into resentment. My husband tried harder in visible ways. He checked in before decisions, followed through on commitments, and resisted the urge to smooth over discomfort with charm. But real change is rarely linear. It doesn't announce itself with grand gestures. It shows up in small moments, especially when no one is watching. I paid attention to those moments. How he spoke about his mother when she wasn't present. Whether he corrected people when they framed me as the villain. Whether he honored boundaries consistently, not just when it was convenient. Sometimes he did. Sometimes he didn't. Each time he slipped, I felt less emotional about it and more analytical. That detachment wasn't coldness. It was clarity. I was no longer emotionally invested in potential. I was invested in patterns. His mother attempted re-entry through indirect means. A holiday card addressed to both of us. A mutual friend mentioning how much she missed me. An email carefully worded to sound reflective without actually taking responsibility. I read them all without reacting. No response was the response. Silence had become my most effective filter. People who genuinely change don't need immediate forgiveness to continue changing. They do the work regardless. Anyone who required validation as proof of progress wasn't actually progressing. I noticed something else too. Without the constant pressure to accommodate, my emotional range expanded. I felt joy without suspicion, anger without guilt, sadness without panic. Emotions moved through me instead of lodging themselves in my chest. I realized how much energy I had spent suppressing my reactions to maintain equilibrium for others. Releasing that responsibility gave me access to a fuller version of myself, one I liked more than the carefully managed version I'd been performing for years. At work, I was offered a leadership role I might have declined in the past, citing family obligations or timing. This time, I accepted without hesitation. The confidence to say yes felt natural. I didn't ask permission. I didn't over-explain. I simply stepped into the opportunity. That decision had a ripple effect. I began making choices based on alignment rather than avoidance. The results spoke for themselves. My husband struggled with this shift. Not because he didn't want me to succeed, but because my independence forced him to confront his own stagnation. Growth in one partner often exposes stagnation in the other. That tension surfaced during conversations about the future. He asked where I saw us in 5 years. I answered honestly. I saw myself fulfilled, grounded, and uncompromised. Whether he was there depended on his ability to meet me without relying on old dynamics. He absorbed that quietly. There was no argument, just understanding. Friends noticed the change before family did. They commented on my presence, my decisiveness, the way I spoke without softening my edges. One friend told me I seemed lighter and stronger at the same time. That combination felt accurate. Strength doesn't always harden you. Sometimes it makes you more flexible because you're no longer afraid of breaking. I carried that insight with me, letting it guide interactions that once would have drained me. There were moments of grief still, not for the affair or the financial betrayal, but for the time lost trying to earn respect from people who benefited from withholding it. Accepting that loss was painful. But grief, I learned, isn't something to fix. It's something to integrate. It reminds you of what mattered and why it hurt. Honoring that pain without letting it define me was part of the healing. One evening, my husband admitted something quietly devastating. He said he didn't know who he was without his mother's influence. That much of his identity had been shaped by pleasing her, defending her, and benefiting from her control. He wasn't asking me to fix that. He was acknowledging it. That distinction mattered. It meant he was finally facing himself rather than outsourcing accountability. Whether he could rebuild from that awareness was uncertain, but the awareness itself was real. I told him something I hadn't said before, that my decision to cancel the credit card wasn't impulsive or vengeful. It was protective. I was protecting myself from a system that required my sacrifice to function. He listened without interrupting. That listening felt different. It wasn't strategic. It was receptive. For the first time, I felt seen rather than managed. As months passed, the story others told about me evolved. Some framed me as ruthless, others as empowered. I stopped caring which version stuck. Identity solidifies when you stop negotiating it. I knew who I was becoming, and that was enough. I didn't need consensus. I needed integrity. The apologies had faded, but the work continued. Not perfectly, not easily, but intentionally. And whether this journey ended in reconciliation or separation, one truth remained constant. I would never again trade my peace for proximity. Anyone who wanted a place in my life would have to meet me where I stood, not where they were comfortable keeping me. The life that emerged from the fallout didn't resemble the one I had fought to preserve. It was quieter in some ways, but more expansive in others. The constant vigilance was gone. I no longer scanned rooms for tension or rehearsed responses to prevent conflict. That mental space filled itself naturally with intention. I woke up without dread. I made plans without contingency strategies. I trusted that whatever happened, I would handle it without losing myself in the process. My marriage existed in a different form now. Less performative, less certain, more honest. We didn't pretend things were fixed. We acknowledged that some fractures don't disappear, they reshape the structure entirely. My husband continued therapy, not to win me back, but to understand himself. That distinction mattered. He stopped asking what I needed from him and started asking what he needed to unlearn. Watching that shift was sobering. Growth isn't flattering. It dismantles ego before it builds character. We spent time apart deliberately. Separate schedules, separate spaces. That distance clarified what proximity had obscured. When we did spend time together, it was intentional rather than habitual. Sometimes it was easy. Sometimes it was strained. I didn't rush to label either. I allowed the relationship to exist without forcing it into a narrative. That patience was something I'd never granted myself before. His mother remained absent by choice. The silence between them hardened into something permanent. I didn't intervene. Their relationship was theirs to navigate. I had learned the cost of inserting myself into dynamics that thrived on triangulation. Protecting my boundaries meant letting others manage their own consequences. That wasn't cruelty. It was clarity. Professionally, My momentum continued. I took on responsibilities that challenged me in ways I'd long postponed. I spoke up in meetings without hesitation. I negotiated without apology. Confidence compounded. The more I trusted myself, the more others did too. It wasn't about dominance. It was about presence. Being fully present in my own life changed how everything else responded to me. Socially, my circle narrowed but deepened. Superficial connections fell away. Genuine ones strengthened. I stopped over-explaining my choices. People who understood didn't need explanations. People who didn't weren't entitled to them. That simplicity felt radical after years of emotional contortions designed to maintain peace. There were moments when the memory of betrayal surfaced unexpectedly. A song, a place. One evening, sitting alone, I thought about the version of myself who stood in the grocery store staring at that transaction alert. She had no idea how far-reaching that moment would be, how a single decision would unravel systems, expose truths, and ultimately lead her back to herself. I felt gratitude for her courage. It hadn't felt like courage at the time. It had felt like necessity. But necessity often disguises bravery. My husband eventually asked if I believed trust could be rebuilt. I answered honestly. Trust isn't rebuilt by declarations. It's rebuilt by consistency over time. Whether that time would be shared remained to be seen. I wasn't closing doors prematurely. I wasn't keeping them open out of fear either. I was allowing reality to unfold without interference. That balance felt earned. The fallout had given me something invaluable. Perspective. I could see clearly now how much of my life had been shaped by accommodating others' discomfort. Releasing that pattern didn't make me selfish. It made me whole. I wasn't responsible for maintaining systems that harmed me. That responsibility had never been mine to begin with. As the months passed, the intensity faded, replaced by a steady sense of self. The drama others had predicted never materialized. There was no explosive ending, no triumphant reconciliation. Just a woman living deliberately, aligned with her values, unafraid of solitude or change. That outcome was more powerful than any revenge fantasy. The credit card remained canceled. The boundaries remained intact. The lessons endured. I understood now that power doesn't come from control over others. It comes from control over yourself. And once you claim that, nothing and no one can take it from you again. Time has a way of revealing which changes are permanent and which are performances. As the months stretched on, the consequences set in more deeply, quietly reshaping lives that once depended on my compliance. What struck me most was how irreversible some of those changes became. Not because I enforced them aggressively, but because once a boundary is respected, it rewrites expectations permanently. People adjust or they drift away. There is no neutral ground. My husband's relationship with his mother never recovered to what it had been. They spoke occasionally, cautiously, like strangers negotiating unfamiliar territory. She no longer offered unsolicited advice or financial solutions. When she did, he declined them. Each refusal carried weight. It signaled a shift from dependency to autonomy. I watched this from a distance, careful not to insert myself. This wasn't my relationship to repair or manage. That restraint was a victory in itself. She tried once more to involve me indirectly. A message passed through a family friend, expressing regret and a desire to clear the air. I declined, not out of spite, but because clarity had already been achieved. Conversations without accountability serve only to soothe the speaker. I wasn't interested in soothing anyone at my own expense again. Declining felt calm, not confrontational. That calm confirmed how far I'd come. The mistress disappeared entirely from our orbit. No messages, no sightings, no secondhand updates. Whatever story she'd been told unraveled once convenience ended. That disappearance brought an unexpected sense of closure. Not because I needed her absence to validate my worth, but because it underscored the transactional nature of what had occurred. Once the transaction ended, so did the relationship. That clarity stripped the betrayal of its mystery. My marriage reached a crossroads that required honesty without negotiation. We had a long conversation one evening, not about blame or reconciliation, but about futures, parallel futures. We spoke about what we wanted independently without framing those desires around each other. The overlap was smaller than it once had been. That realization was painful, but also liberating. Loving someone doesn't obligate you to outgrow yourself to stay aligned. We decided to separate, not in anger, not with drama, with mutual recognition that growth had taken us in different directions. The decision felt final in a way I hadn't anticipated. Not devastating, resolute. Ending the marriage wasn't a failure. It was the conclusion of a chapter that had reached its natural end. Letting go felt cleaner than clinging ever had. The separation was handled quietly. No public announcements. No social media statements. Those who needed to know were told. Others inferred. I didn't correct assumptions. The story belonged to me now, and I chose privacy over performance. That choice was respected more than I expected. Perhaps because people sensed the certainty behind it. Living alone brought a different rhythm. Silence that wasn't heavy. Space that felt intentional. I arranged my home to suit myself without compromise. Every object reflected a choice rather than an obligation. That autonomy was deeply satisfying. It reminded me that partnership should enhance your life, not consume it. Professionally, my trajectory continued upward. The confidence I'd gained translated into leadership roles that demanded decisiveness and vision. I thrived in that environment. It felt aligned with the person I had become through adversity. Challenges no longer felt personal. They felt purposeful. Occasionally, someone would ask about the past, about the affair, about the credit card. I answered simply, yes, it happened. No, I don't regret my response. Then I changed the subject. Dwelling wasn't necessary. The experience had done its work. It had reshaped my values and clarified my standards. That was enough. The consequences that couldn't be undone were not punitive. They were instructive. They taught me that boundaries create new realities. That choosing yourself isn't an act of abandonment, but of integrity. That silence, when intentional, is powerful. And that sometimes the smallest decisions carry the greatest impact. As I moved forward, unburdened by the need to explain or justify, I felt grounded in a way I never had before. The story that began with a declined transaction had evolved into a complete reclamation of self. And that reclamation was irreversible. What remained after everything settled wasn't bitterness or triumph. It was something quieter, steadier, and far more durable. Strength that didn't need witnesses. Confidence that didn't rely on validation. I had learned, through loss and recalibration, how to stand firmly in my own life without bracing for impact. That kind of strength doesn't announce itself. It simply exists, shaping decisions without drama. The separation became official with minimal friction. Paperwork signed, logistics handled, conversations brief and respectful. There were moments of sadness, of course. 20 years of shared history doesn't evaporate cleanly. But there was no regret. Regret requires the belief that a different choice would have honored who I was becoming. It wouldn't have. Staying would have required continued compromise of values I had fought hard to reclaim. Leaving was an act of alignment, not escape. My ex-husband adjusted in his own way. We spoke occasionally, usually about practical matters. The tension that once dominated our interactions was gone. In its place was something neutral, almost courteous. We had both been changed by the experience, though in different ways. I no longer felt responsible for his growth or his pain. That detachment was compassionate, not cruel. It allowed each of us to own our paths without interference. His mother faded completely from my life. No messages, no intermediaries, no attempts at reconciliation. I suspected she framed the outcome in ways that preserve her sense of innocence. That no longer mattered to me. Her story had no bearing on my reality. I had learned that closure doesn't require agreement. It requires acceptance. As I settled into my new routine, I noticed how my internal dialogue had shifted. I no longer questioned my instincts or second-guessed my reactions. When something felt wrong, I trusted that feeling. When something felt right, I pursued it without overthinking. That trust had been eroded slowly over years of subtle invalidation. Rebuilding it took courage, but the results were transformative. I invested time in learning, not just professionally, but personally. I read about boundaries, emotional systems, and self-trust. I recognized patterns in my past that had predisposed me to over-accommodate. Understanding those patterns didn't lead to self-blame. It led to self-compassion. We do the best we can with the tools we have. When we know better, we do better. That simple truth guided me forward. New relationships formed naturally. Friendships deepened. Romantic interest emerged cautiously, intentionally. I didn't rush into anything. I observed how people responded to my boundaries, whether they respected my pace, whether they listened when I spoke. Those criteria mattered more than chemistry or charm. I wasn't looking for intensity. I was looking for consistency. There were moments when I reflected on how differently this story could have unfolded if I had chosen confrontation over consequence. If I had argued, pleaded, or demanded explanations. The outcome might have been louder, but not cleaner. Choosing action over argument preserved my dignity and conserved my energy. That lesson stayed with me. Not everything requires discussion. Some things require decisions. People sometimes asked what advice I would give to someone in a similar situation. I never offered scripts or strategies. I offer perspective. Pay attention to patterns. Notice who benefits from your silence. Understand that generosity without boundaries becomes exploitation. And remember that choosing yourself will always disrupt systems that depend on your self-neglect. That disruption is not your responsibility to manage. The credit card, the affair, the family conflict. They became chapters, not definitions. Important, instructive, but no longer central. My life expanded beyond them. New goals emerged. Travel plans, professional ambitions, creative pursuits I had postponed for years. Each step forward reinforced the same truth. I was capable of building a fulfilling life on my own terms. Sometimes late at night, I would think back to that first notification. How small it seemed. How easily it could have been ignored or rationalized. That moment taught me something profound. Change doesn't always arrive with clarity or certainty. Sometimes it arrives as a choice you make without knowing how far it will carry you. Trusting yourself in those moments is everything. The quiet strength that remained was earned. It was forged in discomfort, refined through reflection, and sustained by self-respect. It didn't require me to harden or close off. It allowed me to remain open without being unguarded. That balance was the greatest achievement of all. I no longer measure my worth by how much I could endure. I measured it by how well I honored myself. That shift changed everything. And as I looked ahead, unburdened by roles that no longer fit, I felt ready. Not for perfection, for honesty, for peace. For a life defined not by what I tolerated, but by what I chose. There is a moment after everything ends when you realize no one can fully take the lesson from you, no matter how clearly you explain it. People can witness the outcome, comment on your strength, even admire your resolve, but the internal shift belongs solely to the person who lived it. I understood that now in a way I never had before. What I gained wasn't transferable. It wasn't advice or strategy. It was embodied knowledge, carved into me through experience. I saw it when acquaintances told me they wished they had my courage. They said it casually, as if courage were a personality trait rather than a muscle built through repeated discomfort. They didn't see the hesitation, the fear, the long nights of uncertainty. They saw the decision after it had already solidified. Strength always looks simpler in hindsight. Living through its formation is far messier. The story circulated in fragments. People reduced it to the credit card, the affair, the separation. They missed the deeper truth. This was never about money. Money was simply the lever that exposed entitlement. The real rupture happened the moment I stopped explaining myself. That was the point of no return. Once you stop asking to be understood by people invested in misunderstanding you, everything changes. I noticed how often people tried to extract meaning from my experience for their own lives. They asked what they should do in similar situations. I resisted the urge to give directives. Each situation has its own context, its own emotional terrain. What worked for me might not work for someone else. The only universal truth I could offer was this: ignoring your own discomfort to preserve someone else's comfort will always cost you more in the end. My ex-husband reached out one final time months later, not to reconcile, not to argue, to thank me. He said losing me had forced him to confront parts of himself he would have avoided forever. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't ask for friendship. He simply acknowledged the impact. That message didn't reopen wounds. It closed the loop. I replied briefly, wishing him well. That exchange felt complete, free of unfinished business. I reflected often on how easily I could have stayed, how socially acceptable endurance would have been. People admire patience far more readily than self-respect, leaving disrupted expectations. It made others uncomfortable. That discomfort was never about me. It was about what my decision implied. That survival doesn't have to look noble. That loyalty has limits. That love without respect is not love at all. The more I settled into my life, the less I felt the need to narrate it. I stopped framing experiences as lessons. I let them simply be. Growth doesn't always require articulation. Sometimes it requires presence. Being fully present in my own choices, without second-guessing or external validation, was enough. I noticed how differently I responded to conflict now. I no longer rushed to resolve tension. I allowed it to exist long enough to reveal its source. Most conflicts resolve themselves once I stopped managing them. Others dissolved when I removed my participation. That discernment was new. It saved me time, energy, and unnecessary emotional labor. I also noticed how peace attracted honesty. People spoke more openly around me. They sensed I wasn't performing or posturing. That authenticity created space for real connection. Conversations deepened. Relationships became simpler. Complexity gave way to clarity. That shift was subtle but profound. Sometimes I wondered what my life would look like if that notification had never arrived. If I had never questioned the charge. If I had continued absorbing discomfort quietly. The answer came easily. Smaller. Quieter. More contained. I felt no nostalgia for that version of myself. Compassion, yes. Longing, no. The lesson no one could take from me was this: you don't need permission to change your life. You don't need consensus or understanding. You don't even need certainty. You need honesty with yourself and the willingness to act on it. Everything else follows. I carried that lesson forward, not as a shield, but as a compass. It guided my decisions without dominating them. It reminded me to pause when something felt off, to listen when my body reacted before my mind caught up, to trust that clarity often arrives after action, not before. As I moved further away from the chaos that once defined my days, I felt grounded in a way that had nothing to do with circumstances. My sense of self was no longer contingent on roles, relationships, or approval. It existed independently, steady, and intact. That independence wasn't lonely. It was liberating. The story that began with a failed transaction ended with something far more valuable: self-trust. And once you have that, no one can spend it, misuse it, or take it from you. It becomes yours permanently, shaping every choice that follows. By the time my life settled into its new shape, I stopped thinking of the entire experience as something that had happened to me. Instead, I began to understand it as something that had been revealed to me. There is a difference between being broken by events and being clarified by them. I had been clarified, stripped of illusions, freed from narratives I didn't author, and standing in the quiet aftermath, I could finally see myself without distortion. I moved forward deliberately, not cautiously, but consciously. Each decision carried weight because it was chosen, not defaulted to. I no longer measured my progress against timelines or expectations set by others. I measured it by alignment. Did this choice bring me closer to myself or pull me back into old patterns? That question guided everything: work, relationships, rest. Even silence became intentional rather than avoidance. Occasionally, someone would mention my former life with curiosity or disbelief. They would ask how I found the strength to do what I did. I always paused before answering, because the truth was simple but uncomfortable. Strength wasn't something I discovered. It was something I stopped suppressing. It had always been there, buried under years of accommodation, politeness, and fear of disruption. Removing those layers didn't create strength. It revealed it. The woman I became after all of this was not harder, colder, or more guarded. She was clearer. She knew what she would tolerate and what she would not. She no longer mistook endurance for virtue or silence for peace. She understood that love without respect corrodes slowly, and that boundaries are not punishments but protections. Those understandings reshaped how I showed up everywhere. I began to trust ease. That was new. In the past, ease felt suspicious, like a calm before collapse. Now it felt earned. I allowed joy without waiting for consequences. I allowed stillness without filling it with worry. That shift alone changed the quality of my days. Life no longer felt like something to manage. It felt like something to inhabit. Sometimes, late in the evening, I would remember how everything started. A declined transaction, a small alert, a moment that could have been dismissed. That memory no longer carried anger or shock. It carried gratitude, not for the betrayal, but for the interruption, for the moment that forced me to stop, look, and choose differently. Not everyone gets that moment. Fewer people take it. I never reinstated the credit card. I never reopened access. Not because I was holding a line, but because there was no reason to. The system that required my sacrifice no longer existed. What replaced it was simpler and more honest. A life built on self-trust instead of self-erasure. The ending people expect from stories like mine is dramatic reconciliation or triumphant independence. Mine was quieter. It was waking up content. It was making plans without anxiety. It was knowing deeply and without question that I would never abandon myself again to keep someone else comfortable. That certainty became my foundation. If there was one truth I carried forward, it was this. When you stop explaining your worth to people who benefit from doubting it, your life expands in ways you cannot predict. That expansion doesn't come with applause. It comes with peace. And peace, once experienced, becomes non-negotiable. This wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of one I finally wrote myself.